welcome everyone officially. Thank you so much for joining us. Today's meeting is something very important to the whole sector. This certainly isn't something that is about, and nor should it be taken to be such, something about women whining that they're not getting their fair share. It's not a whining or complaining session or something else that I'm not going to say. But what this really is taking an objective look based on the information provided to the IRS through 990s over years. And Peggy will speak to it specifically. However, this is data that's been compiled over many years that points to an issue that is, instead of helping the sector, help other people and help the world and help animals and et cetera, it's something that can hold back. So it's something that also doesn't get talked about much until maybe this year. It's something that's been in the headlines quite a bit lately. It's a hot topic. It's been controversial. It's been all over the place. And as a matter of fact, the pay equity research project called 74%, Exploring the Lives of Women in Nonprofit. It's the pay equity research study that Peggy, our special guest today, has headed up. She wrote an op-ed on the Chronicles of Philanthropy's website, and it had more than 6 million impressions. So it's something that resonates, even if it doesn't get spoken of for whatever, it doesn't get spoken about in large audiences very frequently. So Third Sector Today, let me give you a little background about us. Third Sector Today and Top Nonprofits are two online collectives where websites we offer and produce lists, examples, tips, insights, best practices, and free resources like this webinar, specifically for people like you, professionals in the nonprofit space who want to learn more about how you can elevate your cause and have more impact. So let me give you a little bit of information or overview of how this is going to work today. You have the chat box on the left. As a workaround, I'm unfortunately going to have to ask Peggy to let me know when she wants me to advance the slide. We have a couple of poll questions that we will ask of you, and you can participate online during at certain parts of the presentation. And we will, if we have time, we will have a Q&A at the end, but there's not necessarily, I don't know if we'll have time. So feel free, if you have a question to ask, please use that chat box on the left side, and Peggy is very comfortable with me interjecting and asking the question. And then let's see, at the very, let me see, sorry. Again, our intention with this webinar today is to raise awareness and provide tools that we can all take back to our organizations to help elevate the sector. So with that, let me give you a little bit of background on Peggy Morrison Outon. She is the founding executive director at the Baer Center for Nonprofit Management at Robert Morris University in Pittsburgh. And for any of you who will be heading down to the Independent Sector Conference in Miami at the end of October, Peggy is on a panel, and she will be talking about gender inequity in the charitable sector. So you'd get a chance to see her in person, and she will be able to share more information there, and that should be very engaging. The more information about Peggy, she has over 30 years of experience in the nonprofit sector. She has worked with more than 800 nonprofit organizations in terms as a management consultant, and she served as a volunteer on 34 boards, 8 of those as president, and she's done a whole heck of a lot of stuff. So with that, can I please say hello and welcome Peggy for joining us. Welcome. Thank you for joining us, and we're really excited to hear your research and your thoughts on how we can possibly change this problem. So with that.
Thank you so much, Amy.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be with you all today, and those of you who are on the phone. As Amy said, I think constructive dissent is a really good idea in any circumstance, and this is a complex, complicated, and nuanced conversation that we've been having here at the Bear Center in Pittsburgh for about 5 years, and we really learn from each other a lot. So I'm very interested in your thinking and in what works and what doesn't work as we present our argument to you, because it really has moved beyond the data into trying to build a movement. And as Amy said, we have had excellent press coverage throughout the life of this project, and there is a 74% project in Montgomery County from the Montgomery County Community Foundation. They adopted the 74% work for this whole year of 2015, and we look forward to seeing this issue move through your community in a productive and healthy way that leads us to better solutions, not a continuation of this. So I guess I would say to you that one of the things that happened was I turned 60. And when I turned 60, we had been doing a wage and benefit study here in Pittsburgh since the year 2000. So 10 years into that work, I was standing up year after year reporting a pay gap in the nonprofit sector that exceeded the pay gap in the business sector. And it began to really stick in my craw that the social justice sector would have this type of hypocrisy. Also, I, at 60, began to realize I was not going to live forever or work forever, and I had these wonderful young women who work here at the Bear Center and my own beloved daughter who's in her 30s, and I really looked at them and thought, am I going to have to see you all have this same question asked 15 or 20 years down the road? Why is this still true? So with that motivation to say, why is this still true? How can we change this? And what can we do about it? I believe, as many of you do, that evidence is powerful. And so we started to look at the evidence to see what it would show us. And that's what I'm going to talk with you about this afternoon. Thank you so much for giving us information about where you are in your career. And in the group that registered for this webinar, we are really a lot of early and mid-career people with a couple of seasoned people like me mixed in there. But I'm not going to talk as much about retirement and third act for older women as I might if I was talking more to people that were my age. But I will talk to you about how to work with people my age, because I think that's part of our challenge going forward, is finding the most productive way to make use of all of the talent that exists in the sector. So advance the slide, please, Amy. You can see that we were really fortunate to receive a very significant research grant from the Eden Hall Foundation. We have been consistently supported in our work by the Bear USA Foundation, and we have had support from an accounting firm who has to use those wage and benefit studies and help the 990 requirements of benchmarking pay be accurate. So we have built a funding base for this project, and we have also built a kitchen cabinet here in Pittsburgh that is some 175 people who have expressed their willingness to try to work on this issue and see that equity is the norm rather than the outlier, if you will. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk to you today about some of the findings that we have had. I've done nearly 70 interviews. I've done interviews of women in their 20s and women in their 70s. I've talked to a few men mixed in there, talked to a lot of mid-career people, and have been very appreciative of what I have been able to learn in asking people about their direct experience, why they chose nonprofit work, have they ever negotiated, what did their family think of their career choice, how are they thinking about taking care of themselves? What else do they want to learn? These interviews have been a joy to me, and I have really enjoyed every bit of conversation that I've had, and we learned quite a lot from them because there were some key themes which I will talk with you about later. We also have consistently throughout this period of time done focus groups of a variety of ages, of different segments of the sector, health and human service professionals versus arts professionals. We have talked to board members. We have talked to a variety of different kinds of groups. groups. And we also have continually done literature review of how this topic is being treated. Really, one of the other catalytic parts of my thinking was a book called Women and Power in the Nonprofit Sector, which was published in about 1992, and it was the findings of a conference at the University of San Francisco. A number of scholars came together to look at the nonprofit sector and the role of women in it. We invited the editor of that book as part of our 74% work to come, and she validated what we had believed, and that is that there hasn't been a book solely focused on this nonprofit gender issues, power, control, and equity since 1992. So we, as part of our plans, we are working on trying to write such a book because we feel that there has not been sufficient attention paid, and there's lots and lots of stuff being done on pay equity, but not so much focus on research in the nonprofit sector, which is often true for nonprofit issues. Next slide, please. So one of the things that interested us, of course, is that the stakes for society have steadily gone up because the nonprofit sector has grown and grown and grown and grown. The chart you see before you starts in 1990. If we had been able to go back to 1970, you would have seen a similar sort of a growth line. And in 1970, one of the things that changed in the workforce was that women became far more likely to work outside the home than they previously had been. So one of the things that I find fascinating to look at here is the growth of the number of nonprofits of all sorts and types across the nation, and the amount of women in the labor force. There's a rather similar line there between those two things. So it's probably no surprise that women comprise about 3/4 of the nonprofit sector's workforce. If you would, Amy, next slide. So just to set that lesson a little bit, you will see this slide addresses the division of the workforce by sector. And it shows you that in business, in the private sector, about 63% or 2/3 of the workforce is men, about 1/3, a little over, is women. In the public sector, it's roughly half and half, and they have the least issues around pay equity because the public sector is guided by tests and certifications in a variety of ways that salaries get set, and so it tends to be much more gender blind. And then you look at our nonprofit sector and you see this 74% women, 26% men. And that is, our work is all focused on southwestern Pennsylvania. But if you look at GuideStar and other national studies, you will see a similar, not maybe exactly the same, but a very similar thing. And it's been true for as long as I've been working in the sector, that the sector was dominated by women, and that the primary focus is female employees, not female power brokers, shall we say. Okay, so let's look at the next slide, which looks a little bit at so we've been having a conversation in our society about executive compensation and who makes a lot more money, and so this is one that just looks again at all the workers are the darker shade on that slide, and then what the chief executive is paid with regard to the average pay of a worker in the sector. And you'll note there with some interest that nonprofits have more of a disparity between top pay and regular workers' pay than does state government, local government, but way, way, way less than private industry. So, Amy, I believe we're ready for our first poll. And I can't see it.
I was muting myself there. Okay, everybody. I hope you can see the poll, which should. Yes, I see votes coming in. The question is, does gender matter in compensation? And I'm reading this out loud because as people hear it in the on-demand version, they won't see the actual poll come up. So, okay, it looks like we've got everyone's participated. So, does gender matter in compensation? Yes, received 75% of the vote, and no, received 25% of the vote. What do you think about that, Peggy? What do you think your thoughts?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I wish that I could be looking into the eyes of the people who said that they do not believe gender matters, because I think that as we go through our data, it will be quite clear that there is a gender bias at work. Now, you can unpack this data and
oh, sorry, Peggy. I wonder if part of it
yes.
too is the interpretation of the question, as in whether it was should gender matter or do you think gender does play a role? Do you know what I mean? It could be.
Well, and we are very appreciative of the other people in this space, most notably the Women's Institute for Policy and Research, who are really the grandmamas of pay equity research. Once again, their focus is on the entire workforce, not on the nonprofit workforce, but they have given us all kinds of good data. So you can unpack this in lots of ways. Our research against the 990s, and we had research done on several hundred 990s in various sized organizations, which you can put the next slide up, Amy. But, there is an indissoluble gender bias that is about 6 or 7%. And then you can start playing with the factors of do women leave the workforce to raise children or take care of ailing parents? What effect does that have? But we know for sure that as young MBAs come out of college, female MBAs are offered less money than male MBAs, and that pattern of accepting lower salaries at the beginning of their career has a profound effect over the course of the career. So what you have before you here is we looked at 3 sized nonprofits as we were trying to understand this issue. And there is a data set that was available to us that showed a pretty clear break at $7 million in annual operating budget or above, and those were the large nonprofits in our region. And there are over 100 in the southwestern PA region that have budgets in excess of $7 million a year. We took the mid-sized frame to be 1 million to 7 million, and then below 1 million to be the small. And of course, the data gets much more difficult to find the smaller they become because they don't have to report on the 990 in the same way that larger ones who pay larger salaries do. So we will share data sets with you all or be happy to show you the specific and the detail. I'm very fortunate in my researcher, Carrie Tancrader, who is a doctoral candidate here and has been a 10-year employee here at the Bear Center. So she's been absolutely excellent and had to start taking motion sickness pills because she was getting seasick scrolling through the 990s trying to find all of this information. But at any rate, you see that in the large organizations, women's earning power is the least. In mid-sized, it's a little bit better, and in small, it's about 3/4 of the thing in executive positions. What is also true, and I believe you'll see this on the next slide, please, is that female leadership. So we're not only interested in pay equity, we're interested in power and influence equity. And what you see there is that in the smaller nonprofits where salaries are inevitably lower, about 2/3 of the executive directors are women. When you look at those large nonprofits, once again, that have budgets in excess of $7 million annually, only about 1/3 of those executive director chairs are held by women. So there is a quite disproportionate or a dismaying fact here that shows that women work in the small and the struggling to a much greater degree than they do in the large and powerful ones. And we also, I think that we were one of the few who got curious about how the gender of the board chair affected these pay situations. And so we also looked at what was the sex of the board chair. And in small organizations, there is a female chair in 1/3 of them, and in large organizations, less than 1/4 of them have female chairs. So in the big organizations, we have primarily an industry of male executives and male board chairs, and that is a profound thing that we have learned about the effect of gender on pay.
Peggy, if I can ask, I'm sorry, if I could just ask you a question about those 2 graphs. So maybe something you could share from something you've learned from the interviews in terms of just giving a little bit of an analysis of this. Why, in terms of the why behind it? So your data is showing this. Do you have, based on the aggregate verbatim responses from people, some kind of idea as to why that is? Was it, well, that's what I earned, or that women are more empathetic and they're willing to take less? How does that happen?
Let me go ahead and finish my my thought there about the gender of the board chair. So what we specifically found, and we can send our infographic to your group, Amy, if you would like us to. It's all on there. But what we specifically found was that in that larger nonprofit, which had about 75% of the board chairs were men, and they were supervising the work of 75% male CEOs. It advantaged you of an average of $90,000 a year over a woman executive who has a woman as her board chair. So there are lots of theories. We've spent a lot of time thinking about the why of it. I've been a board chair, as you reported to the group, 8 times, and I thought, when I was a board chair, I thought my job was to build consensus, to listen to the board, and to try to take an acceptable decision from the whole of the group. I believe that in many cases with these men who have male board chairs, they are captains of industry. They are highly successful men themselves. They have an opinion that you need to pay people to retain them. And they say, is he doing a good job? Yes, he is. Then we need to keep him, and we need to pay him, and I think we need to pay him this. They are measuring against salaries that are much bigger than the salaries in the nonprofit sector by and large. And so decisions are undertaken about pay often in a somewhat casual process, but in an effective process. Everybody should want to have a man as their board chair if your objective is to make more money, because that is what our data shows. So I think women often have a sense of leadership as being a consensual process, and men have a concept of leadership as being a decisive process. And so part of our work is to try to bring this to the attention, and we have been successful in hearing from our people here in southwestern Pennsylvania that women board chairs are stung when they hear this information, and they say to their women CEOs, we've got to do something about it, and people get raises. And nothing gives me more pleasure than to hear that people get raises. So this information about the way in which people see their job or their role permeates not only the staff size, where women are reluctant to ask. They do not negotiate to the same degree that men do, and they tend to ask for raises before they join a nonprofit, according to my interviews, because once they are part of the nonprofit, they're in the family. Or they say, I just have to raise it. Why do I want to why do I have to get more money? So there's a lot. This is, as I said, a complex and nuanced conversation. But when I talk about this with women, and I think most of the people on this call today are, I've said, this is like the old Pogo cartoon, guys. This is, we have met the enemy, and it is us. We need to be much more engaged in sponsoring, mentoring, encouraging, and looking out for the careers of women, and making sure that equity is insisted upon in our boardrooms. In my interviews, I had interviewed one woman who works for a woman's organization, had an all-female board, and when the data came out about the pay, her board said to her, well, we pay you as well as any other woman in Pittsburgh. She said, how about any other person who's doing a good job? So there's lots to this. Let's take just a quick look at the next slide, the wage gap by educational attainment. You can see that basically what is true, a woman with a doctorate over her lifetime makes only a little bit more than a man with a bachelor's. A woman with a bachelor's makes about the same amount of money as a man who has any college. So we are very excited, and of course I work in an institution of higher education, so we are very thrilled to see women embracing higher education and increasingly educating themselves more and more. And I'm very hopeful that over time that is going to translate into compensation. But right now, our highly educated nonprofit workforce of women is still struggling with a disproportionate pay gap over men who have the same educational background. Next slide, please. But we do not see this, as I said, this is a woman's issue and not a women versus men's issue, because although women lose salary in female-dominated industries, it's worse for men. So we believe that there is common cause for all of us to say if fairness, performance, and equity was the rule, it would be better for everyone who works in a nonprofit, man or woman. Next slide, please. So I told you that I had done 60 or 70 interviews. And Amy, do you have any questions that I need to before I start into this part?
Thanks. You covered the question that I had, and I don't have any that come in other than the ones we had at the beginning from registration. So whenever you want to address any of those.
Okay, you can give me one of those, because actually
sure.
That email never arrived either, so I don't have them.
What problems I had today. I am so sorry about that.
No problem.
I sent it right after we get off the phone, too. Bear with me for a quick second. I should be saying that. Okay, here's one of the questions. This is the very involved one, which is, I think you'll be getting a lot of insight on this today. I've spent more than 15 years working to promote equality, equity, and access to the benefits of civil society, currently working on gender issues. I want to know how a sector that is supposed to be solving problems can justify promoting poverty, wages, gender pay inequity, and the lack of overall diversity in its own workforce, and what we idealists still slogging away in the nonprofit industrial complex can do about it.
So, boy, is that a heartbreaker, and is that a concise picture of what is all too often true. And here's what I have come to believe as I have unpacked this problem over the last 5 years. I believe that most of you who work in smaller nonprofits, but even those who work in bigger, have a really thin HR function. Many nonprofits, of course, the vast majority of nonprofits have 10 or fewer employees, and so it does not justify having an HR director. So you look to your board member who does HR for a corporation and hope that they can help you, but in point of fact, HR is largely absent in nonprofit organizations. Now, this is changing, and we're working to correct it, and others in our community work every day to see that HR improves in nonprofits. But in point of fact, it's an unfunded mandate, and in many cases, the attention to issues around diversity, inclusion, pay equity, professional development, all of those things have gone largely unattended because there's no funding for it. The funding has been directed towards programs and services. We are in service to our community, and so we do want to feel that we are doing our programs and services. And the whole conversation about overhead and infrastructure and all of that has been a distorted and unfortunate one, in my opinion, in many ways. And one of the ways has been that there has been little or no attention paid to good practice in HR. So if we don't have HR, then how are we going to deal with these situations as they come up, except anecdotally and on occasion? And I'm going to talk some more about how we think we can be helpful and what we hope you're going to be interested in doing. But the fact of the matter is we are kind of behind the gun because we don't have the structure. People usually have personnel policies, but that doesn't translate into a talent acquisition and retention strategy, and I think it needs to, because as a baby boomer myself, we are going to eventually exit the scene. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second, but we are going to be in a war for talent, and it's not just going to be the executive, it's going to be the CFO and the program director and all kinds of things, because we are simply not going to have the same volume of people until the millennials get there, and they need to learn a few things as they go go along as well. And so we've got to make more of a focus on how we are going to encourage people to want a nonprofit career and have a concept of a career in addition to a nonprofit cause. So I hope that's helpful to the answer to that question, but I do think that part of it is a greater focus on improving HR practice across the board in nonprofits. And now, if I may, I'll talk a little bit about my interviews. So the next slide that says, "It chose me," I've told you all that I asked a number of questions of almost 70 people, and the first question I asked was, why did you choose nonprofit work? And to an eerie degree, people said back to me, well, it chose me. And what I heard in these responses, and as I asked them about their family's influence and their education, was that there was a very strong sense of calling, that people feel called to work in the nonprofit sector, that it allows them to live their values and to do work that makes them feel valuable in a large sense, whether it's a spiritual sense or a humanistic sense. They are there because they were called to the work. And so it chose me. I have worked in nonprofit management and governance support for since the middle 80s. So this is my life's work, what I'm talking to you about here. And I have worked hard to see that my organizations that I work with can compete. I want them to thrive. I don't want them to survive. I want them to thrive. I want them to be, I want them to knock the socks off society. And so we've worked hard to bring business practices and professionalism and help with IT support and, make everything just go and upgrade. But if we have in any way discouraged that impulse to do good, that impulse that says society should be better and I'm going to make it better by my own work, then shame on us, because this sense of calling is one of the profound success factors for the nonprofit world. And the generosity of spirit that keeps people working and not averting their eyes is one of the things that's most valuable and important. So part of what I want to lift up out of all of this research, which is a lot about numbers and, business practices, is that it chose me, and we need to be tremendously respectful of the power and importance of that. Next slide, please. So I mentioned, and many of you on our phone call today are younger people. I can tell nobody's going to retire within 10 years, according to the poll that we did. So I was pretty interested and rather dismayed when I asked all of my interviews, have you experienced discrimination, and of what sort? And so, of course, I heard about racial discrimination on occasion, and that was very dismaying and no surprise, unfortunately, to any of us. I also even heard about religious discrimination. A few Jewish people told me anti-Semitic stories. Oh, my Lord, can this possibly be true? But it was. But with younger people of all races and cultures, younger people talked to me about age discrimination. They talked about being discounted and condescended to and sort of, in effect, patted on the head and told to, go away. Pittsburgh has one of the older populations in the country. I think we have more people who are second generation to live in the family home, and we have a very large area agency on aging here, and, all of those sorts of things. I had observed our boards and seen that many boards have people well over 70 who are the leaders of the boards. So it wasn't entirely surprising to me, but Pittsburgh as a community is as an eds and meds community. We have many students in Pittsburgh, and there's been a lot of effort made to retain the talent from Carnegie Mellon University and the University of Pittsburgh and Carlow College and, et cetera, et cetera. So there's been a lot of community conversation about retaining our youthful talent and the value of having younger people choose to live in Pittsburgh and work here. And so this was terrible to me to hear that younger people, I mentioned to you all Carrie Tancrader, who is our doctoral student and our researcher and my colleague here at the Bear Center. Well, she's in her early 30s, and she was a ballerina as a girl, so she's lovely to look at and has blonde hair and big blue eyes. And I came back from, about the 16th time I'd heard this, I'm young and I'm condescended to, and I said to her, gosh, and it's even worse if you're pretty. And she said, welcome to my world. So we really need to call this out and say, if the nonprofit sector is going to be healthy going forward, we need to be sure that our practices in the way in which people are given jobs and promoted in jobs is responsive to the fact that we need younger people to lead, to learn, and to grow. And how are we doing things inadvertently and unconsciously that are preventing that from happening? Next slide, please. And so then I also talked to women who were maybe 10 to 15 years into their careers, so late 30s, early 40s, and I heard to a dismaying degree, I feel stuck. And I started thinking, why would that be true? Because when I was in my 30s, I worked for 7 years at an art museum in Austin, Texas. I loved the work. I loved the place. But it became clear to me after 7 years that I had gone as far as I could go. So this whole matter of a career ladder in nonprofits is a challenge because most nonprofits have very small staffs, and unless somebody leaves, there is not another place for you to move up. So when I was in my 30s, the nonprofit sector was exploding, and when I decided that I could no longer advance at the nonprofit where I was working, I worked to put my resume out there, and I had another job in 2 months. Now, I hope and believe I was employable, but it really wasn't that. It was that there was a lot going on, and there was a lot of churn. And so the way you built your career, in my experience, was you moved. You did a body of work for 5 years in an organization or 6. When you got to the point where you'd done as much as you could do there, you found another job, you repurposed yourself, you replanted yourself, you learned some more things, you got some more experience, you got a little bit more money, and then you moved. But when we looked into the tenure of women my age, we saw that it had extended by 50%. So the downturn, and when after 9/11, older people got worried about their retirement funds, and then they began to have a little bit more confidence again and began to think and plan for retirement. And then 2008 happened. And since 2008, we've been in a sluggish place where people are very nervous about the future and are holding on to their job with their fingernails. So these women in their late 30s and early 40s are stuck because there isn't the same movement in our industry that there once was, and they're not being able to move. And then they're in jobs where HR is not as intentional, and so we've taught classes here on how to make the job you have the job you want. If that's the only job you can get, then how can we build in greater opportunity for development and leadership and a chance to try out? Because we need those people in the Gen X generation to step up in the next 5 to 10 years and know how to do that. So the next slide shows a little bit more about this lack of mobility that I was just talking about. And I think, once again, this points to the extreme importance of improved HR practice throughout the nonprofit sector. If I could see the next slide, please, Amy. So this slide is titled Opportunities for Younger Nonprofit Women, Professional Women, and we are interested in using other people's research as much as we possibly can. We are indebted to our folks here in Pittsburgh, like the Forbes Funds, give us good information very frequently that we can use. And Compass Point in San Francisco has done the Daring to Lead study for a number of years. They release it every 5 years, and we find it fascinating and really useful as we think about all of this. And as I said, the people in D.C. So we've really tried to pay attention to what other people were finding out and put it into our thinking as well. So one of the things that the Daring to Lead study talks about is that younger women are very ambivalent about being an executive director. Frankly, they look at the executive directors and see these sometimes somewhat overburdened and haggard people who are, worn to a frazzle, as my mother used to say, and they're not so keen to have that job. Work-life balance is something that is really valued, and they look at it and think it's going to be really a challenging thing. And then you see that third point that we talked about a bit earlier, which says women graduates earn 7% less than men, even after you control for any variable that you possibly could. Next slide, please. I mentioned to you that we also had concern and interest in retirement for older professional women. In the 80s, I worked for an art museum, and I worked with a brilliant woman who was such a strong and effective leader. But she didn't move out of that place. She stayed there, and I knew about how raises were usually 2 or 3%, and so I'm estimating that at the end of her career, where she had done fabulous work, and for a long time, she was probably making about $70,000 a year. I also know that retirement funds, in a good year, we got matching. In a bad year, we did not. So her retirement funds probably had not grown in the way that they should have over the period of time. And she was a single person supporting herself. And so it haunted me that she would have a retirement that was deeply constrained because she had chosen to work in this idealistic and generous way at a community art museum. We deserve to see these older women who have given their lives in service to the community, that they have a decent retirement. They don't have to travel to Europe every year, but they have to be able to have some confidence in the future. And so there was another study done, again, out of California that was looking at the concerns of older nonprofit women, and you see some of the things that they say. They're very worried about their organization's viability. Is that real or is that arrogance? You have to think about that yourself. I think most of our organizations, none of us are indispensable, and smart people will figure stuff out after we leave, just as we've tried to figure stuff out while we were here. But many, many nonprofits are small and fragile, and they're kind of held together with spit and baling wire, and so those leaders are worried that once they leave, they may not be able to, that organization may fold. Most of them are not particularly interested in rocking in Florida for the rest of their life. They reject an image of this sort of golden years kind of thing, and they expect to have some kind of work and service. Many of them plan to serve on nonprofit boards. A lot of them plan to be consultants. So watch out, you're going to have lots of consultants in your life going forward. But nonetheless, we need to be thinking, if they don't want that, how can we best put that talent to work, and how can we be respectful of their need to work shorter hours, fewer hours, and have more flexibility in their schedule than perhaps a younger person. But still, how can they continue to make a real contribution and still get out of the way of younger people who have a chance to be the ones in charge? And then finally, we did a lot of looking at these issues around how much money you need. And you see that one of the facts that we found was all workers, men and women, need to plan to replace 126% of their current salary. And most people are on track to replace about 2/3 of it. This is largely because of health care costs. But, oh, my goodness, that's a scary thing right there. So we, next slide, Amy, we began to think about what does a nonprofit career path look like, and we realized that like heart disease research, which is largely shaped by men and men's reaction to various problems, the sort of career path that had been sketched had largely been shaped by men. And since nonprofit sector is 74% women, we thought let's try to think about it. And this is a first effort, and we welcome any ideas or criticism, but we do believe that part of what is true is that we are not seeing the nonprofit sector building its bench. We do not see older women taking a lot of time for mentoring and activities to sponsor and encourage younger people. That's not universally true. Nothing I have said is universally true, but it is true in general. And so we got to thinking, and we realized that in many cases where a man who starts in his mid-20s, by the time he's 50 or so, he has sort of gotten as far as he's probably going to go, and so he begins to put his energy into the future, into nurturing and growing the next generation of leaders. For women at 50, many of them have just now gotten their children out of the house. They can begin to travel. They can begin to work at night and on the weekends in a way that was not possible for them before. They began to yearn to have career success. At the same time, you all know this, men are from Mars and women are from Venus stuff, but about the same time that the men in their lives are beginning to crave community service. So another one of those challenging things. But if a woman is just really getting her feet under her at 50 or 55, she has a very short time to make her mark, and her time to spend growing the next generation is perhaps less than it needs to be. So we have drawn from a couple of sources on this. Alice Eagley, who wrote a really excellent book called Through the Labyrinth, and then an article out of the Atlantic Monthly. Anne Marie Slaughter wrote Why Women Still Can't Have It All. And we invite your thoughts and participation on what does a nonprofit career path look like, and what difference does it make for women, whether they're raising children or going to school longer or trying to keep their life in balance. How does that affect our compensation and our success? So one more thing. Next slide, please, Amy. One more thing about transitioning nonprofit professionals. So older people in that study that we used out of California showed that, again, the vast majority are going to stay in the nonprofit space. If you see 16% in philanthropy, 23% in consulting, and 32% in nonprofit, about a quarter of people think they will do something other than continue to somehow work in the nonprofit arena. And the next slide, please. We're getting towards our close here. Amy, am I missing any questions?
You know what? I think you've covered them, but just to remind, let me see. The question was, how can I ask for a raise, or how can I get a raise? Mm-hmm. I think that a lot of the data that you've brought here answers that, but certainly if you would think that there's more to speak to on that.
Okay. Sure.
Go right ahead.
Let's put a pin in that one, and
Okay.
Let me ask you to move to the slide that's titled Board of Directors Responsibility as Employers.
Okay.
Because what we are doing, in addition to salary negotiation, which is an important topic and one thing that we have worked on with young people and others, but we're trying to create a culture where it's possible for you to get a raise. So the Board of Directors' responsibility as employers is another place where we feel the sector needs to dramatically advance. So most board of directors, when you all recruit your board of directors, and if we help you recruit your board, then we're always asking, do they have a passion for the mission? Because, of course, we don't want anyone in our organizations who doesn't burn to see the world work right for disabled people or for young children who can't read or for elderly or whatever. So we have put a bar that says we've got to have people in our leadership who burn for the mission. And then the way our funding comes, so focused on programs and services, they spend a great deal of time at the board meetings talking about how are we meeting our mission through our programs, how are we evaluating our effectiveness on our programs, how are we serving our community through our programs, with very little conversation in general on what about the people who work here. How are we taking care of the people who work here? What is our priority in trying to retain staff to continue to do the programs that we are receiving funding for? Those sorts of things. That's really not a common topic at the board table. And we think it needs to get its place on the agenda, not just once a year when it's time to do the CEO's evaluation, although you see that in the study Daring to Lead, only 55% of CEOs received any evaluation at all. And of those 55%, less than 20% received an evaluation that was helpful to them or helped them grow or develop. So evaluation is one of those ways that we think boards can be more engaged as employers. We do not want them to micromanage or get into the business of the executive director or CEO, but we do want them to be asking enough questions to know, are people being fairly treated? Is there professional development? Are there any dollars dollars available for professional development? Are people being given clear opportunities to advance and being invited to apply for jobs that as time goes on, et cetera? And so we see that board members often see their role ending once they hired the new executive, and there will be a lot of that going on in the next 10 years because of retirements and other reasons. But the new leaders, once the person is hired, there needs to be good connection to goals, strategic direction, the rest of the staff, all of these things. So we need to just see that boards began to see that a significant part of their responsibility is to serve as an employer of people, and that it's a scandal, as the question that was asked earlier. I have had clients here in human services whose own staff people could qualify for the programs that the nonprofit provided because they were paid so little. I don't think that's right. I don't think that people who do a good job and work a full week ought to be making so little money that they are at the poverty level. There's an inherent hypocrisy that bothers my heart. The next slide is just a graphic on what I said to you about the evaluation practice. So let's look at the slide that is titled, How Can We Assure Young Nonprofit Professional Women Have Opportunity for Increased Responsibility and Leadership Roles? There again, I think we have to speak directly to the senior managers and put this as a charge against which they will be evaluated to see how younger people are progressing inside their organizations. But I also think that this is often a place where board members can have some productive influence. They can serve as mentors and sponsors and things like that. But mostly, I just want this question to be asked over and over and over again. How are we equipping younger leaders to lead? How intentional? We don't have professional development programs like people in retail do that get out of college and go into a management program. We seldom see that. So how can we be far more intentional about saying, we need you to be as smart and effective as you can possibly be? How can we help you gain skills and abilities? Our next question on the next slide is about older professional women. And again, we are putting these questions before you because we wish you would take billboards out in your community with these questions on them. How can we assure young professional women have opportunity for increased responsibility? How can we help older nonprofit professional women to perhaps think differently, to retool their careers, and to eventually retire with dignity? So I said they don't want to just retire. So can we begin to be far more open to part-time jobs that are substantive jobs that have real responsibility but are not necessarily the executive director? How can we take the skill and knowledge and wisdom and energy and enthusiasm that characterizes so many of the baby boomers in the nonprofit sector and keep it working for us, but maybe not as the senior management? And then finally, the question that we have is how can we strengthen the board of directors' sense of responsibility to their employees? How can we make this case that HR is not a frill or not a nice to have? It is a critical success factor for any business, and it is true in nonprofits as it is in for-profits. So we'd like to get a poll from you to see a little bit about what are the most important next steps. If we have to focus, and of course we do, because we are a small nonprofit just like many of you, so how should we focus our attention on trying to develop solutions? Should we focus it on improving professional development? Should we focus it on expanding opportunities for part-time or shared work? Or should we be focusing it on strengthening the governance of nonprofits around the issues of HR? So, Amy, have you put that poll up?
Yes, Peggy, I have. The poll is up. It's what are the most important next steps? And everyone is participating. We have, let's see, we've got all the votes are in. Thank you, guys. 75% responded with improved professional development. 25% expand opportunities for part-time or shared work.
Okay. So you're not very hopeful about your boards, huh, guys? Let me tell you, they're the ones who set the salaries. But I take the message that we need to really be very attentive to trying to improve things for younger people. So we think that maybe one of the things that you can do is sort of take a pledge, that you can say, this shall not stand, and I'm going to make sure that I do everything I can in my individual personal power to see that it is not. And we think the pledge could be something like, I believe the nonprofit sector has a social justice responsibility. Therefore, I pledge to do everything I can to better assure that gender and racial equity is in my workplace in order for me to be more effective and the workplace to be more equitable. So that's not exactly poetry, but you get my drift. Each one of us has an ability to change this, to make it not true in our own behavior. We can look and help another person learn and grow. I've just come back from a conference at Stanford where they said that after 9/11, the teams that were working for the CIA that helped each other were the most effective teams, that it wasn't standard leadership. It was the generosity to stop what you're doing and help somebody else when they need it. And that characterized a team that ultimately was more effective in combating terrorism in this time. So each one of us can take a pledge that we're going to see that we behave in a way that promotes equity. We're going to ask questions inside our organizations about how things are done. We're going to try to see that our boards pay greater attention, and we're going to be an active and vocal sponsor of fairness in the nonprofit world. Last slide, please. And I leave you today with one of my very favorite quotes of all time, which reads, "History says don't hope on this side of the grave. But then once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history can rhyme." I believe, brothers and sisters, that we are going to be that longed-for tidal wave of history, and that the zeitgeist is swirling in our favor, and that the younger generation is not going to let inequity be true. So thank you for all that you do to make the world a better place, and I hope you learned something from today's conversation, and I appreciate your interest. Thanks a lot.
Peggy, thank you very much. I'm going to wrap it up just on your final words. Thank you, and thanks to all of you. I can't even add to what you've just said. Thank you for sharing this with us. I hope everybody on this call goes back and shares, and as Peggy really explained, that standing by and watching compliance to bad practices will not help anybody in the long run. So thank you all for devoting time to this today. Keep an eye out for an email. I will send you a follow-up this afternoon. And certainly reach out to me if you have any questions, and I will include Peggy's information too, her contact information, so you can follow up with her if you have any questions regarding the materials. Again, have a great day. Keep doing what you guys are doing. You do fabulous work. Thank you. And until next time, take care. Thank you. Bye, Peggy.
Bye.